What if the most dangerous people in positions of authority aren't the obviously corrupt ones, but the ones who genuinely believe they're doing the right thing? Picture this: a leader making catastrophic decisions while completely convinced they're saving everyone. They're not lying to you. They're lying to themselves so effectively that reality has become optional. Take Emperor Nero, who began his reign as Rome's golden boy, a cultured, artistic leader who lowered taxes and expanded citizens' rights. Yet, within a decade, he had murdered his own mother, kicked his pregnant wife to death, and burned half of Rome while allegedly playing his lyre. Ancient historians describe a man so convinced of his own divine genius that he saw critics as enemies of art itself, and opposition as treason against the gods. How does someone transform from promising young ruler to monster while maintaining absolute conviction in their own righteousness? This pattern isn't confined to tyrants and emperors. Howard Hughes began as a brilliant aviator and filmmaker, wielding enormous industrial and political influence, only to spiral into paranoid isolation so complete that he believed invisible enemies were plotting against him. His mistrust didn't just destroy his own empire, it left thousands of employees and investors in chaos, all because one man's delusions became the guiding principle of an entire corporate kingdom. This isn't just about isolated cases of megalomania. Research by social psychologist Cameron Anderson shows that people in power systematically overestimate their own knowledge and abilities while becoming blind to their limitations. But 5 centuries ago, an Italian diplomat observed this deadly pattern with such precision it feels prophetic. Niccolò Machiavelli wasn't just a political theorist, he was a battlefield observer of Renaissance power struggles. When he wrote The Prince in 1513, he wasn't crafting an instruction manual for tyrants, but documenting the psychological metamorphosis that transforms capable leaders into dangerous autocrats. He identified the mental architecture that inevitably corrupts judgment, and modern neuroscience has validated his insights with disturbing precision. When Machiavelli observed that everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are, he was mapping a fundamental psychological trap. Power creates an asymmetric relationship with truth. The higher you climb, the more people see only your curated public image, while fewer witness your private struggles, doubts, and failures. This isn't mere image management, it's the beginning of a dangerous psychological transformation. The mechanism operates through what we now understand as social proof distortion. Most people encounter you only in contexts where you're performing competence, giving presentations, making decisions, appearing confident. They rarely see you confused, uncertain, or wrong. Over time, this creates a feedback loop where the only version of yourself you consistently encounter is the successful, decisive leader everyone else sees. But Machiavelli identified something even more sinister. His observation that he who seeks to deceive will always find someone who will allow himself to be deceived revealed how leaders become victims of their own influence. It's not just that powerful people can manipulate others, it's that they inevitably attract people who want to believe their version of reality. Employees who depend on your approval, advisors who benefit from your success, media figures who gain access through flattery. They all have incentives to validate whatever you want to hear. The final stage involves what modern psychology calls motivated reasoning at scale. Unlike ordinary people who must eventually confront contradictory evidence, powerful leaders can use their resources to manufacture supportive information. They hire consultants who confirm their biases, fund research that supports their positions, and surround themselves with media that frames their failures as victories. This process feels entirely rational from the inside. You're not seeking false information. You're consulting real experts who understand the situation better than the pessimists and naysayers who doubt you. You're not creating propaganda. You're fostering a positive environment focused on solutions rather than problems. Neuroscientist Sukhvinder Obi's research reveals the biological dimension of this transformation. Brain scans show that powerful people experience reduced activity in the neural circuits responsible for empathy and social cognition. The very act of wielding authority physically rewires your brain to make perspective-taking more difficult. Power literally makes you less capable of understanding how others think and feel, including how they really perceive your performance. Look at Enron's executives. After years of being praised as visionaries and treated like geniuses, they came to believe their fraudulent accounting was innovation. They weren't just fooling investors, they'd fooled themselves. By the end, they saw critics not as truth-tellers, but as enemies of progress. This is the foundational pathology underlying every leadership disaster. Power systematically severs the feedback mechanisms that keep ordinary minds anchored to reality. And without those anchors, even exceptional intelligence drifts toward dangerous self-deception. The most immediate manifestation of this reality distortion appears in personnel decisions. Machiavelli's diagnostic insight that the first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him wasn't about judging political appointments. It was about recognizing the early warning signs of cognitive collapse. Effective leaders actively seek advisors who will challenge their assumptions and expose their blind spots. Delusional leaders gradually populate their inner circle with people who make them feel smart, validated, and beloved. The transition happens slowly, often unconsciously, as the psychological pressure to maintain their self-image grows stronger than their commitment to accurate information. This shift accelerates because of what psychologists call the Dunning-Kruger effect in reverse. While incompetent people overestimate their abilities, people who have achieved genuine success often become overconfident about their expertise in areas outside their competence. A brilliant tech entrepreneur starts believing they understand urban planning. A successful investor assumes they can revolutionize education. A gifted athlete thinks they comprehend complex policy issues. When you believe your success in one domain proves your superiority across all domains, disagreement feels like ignorance. Advisors who question your judgment appear to misunderstand your capabilities. Gradually, you begin selecting team members based on their recognition of your exceptional talents rather than their own expertise or independence. The result is what organizational psychologists call groupthink acceleration. Not only do you stop hearing diverse perspectives, but your team actively reinforces your existing beliefs while competing to demonstrate their loyalty through increasingly extreme validation of your ideas. Take Roman Emperor Caligula. He declared himself a god and made his horse a consul, and those around him played along. Senators competed to worship him, while anyone who questioned his actions was replaced. In his eyes, they weren't being reasonable. They just couldn't grasp the logic of a living god. The tragic irony is that these leaders often started with genuine talent and made genuinely good decisions. Their initial success wasn't accidental. They possessed real skills and insights. But once the advisor trap springs, their connection to the feedback that kept them sharp gets severed, and their decision-making quality rapidly deteriorates. The second major manifestation emerges from what Machiavelli called the love-fear paradox. His famous insight that it is much safer to be feared than loved, because love is preserved by the link of obligation, which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage, wasn't advice on political strategy. It was a warning about the psychological trap of needing to be liked while wielding authority. The mechanism operates through what social psychologists call moral licensing. When people do something they consider virtuous, they feel psychologically permitted to behave less ethically later. But for powerful leaders, this effect amplifies because they have more opportunities to act on these feelings and fewer people willing to challenge their moral reasoning. Research by Dan Ariely shows that people who see themselves as fundamentally ethical are actually more likely to engage in minor dishonesty because they can rationalize small transgressions as exceptions that don't threaten their core identity. For leaders whose entire authority rests on being perceived as morally superior, this rationalization process becomes sophisticated and dangerous. The trap manifests in stages. First, you make decisions based on how they'll appear rather than their actual consequences. You avoid difficult but necessary choices that might damage your image. You begin crafting narratives that cast your self-interest as noble sacrifice. Eventually, you start believing these narratives yourself. Then, when critics emerge, they threaten not just your position, but your entire identity. If you're convinced that you're fundamentally good and your critics are questioning your goodness, they must be fundamentally bad. This transforms normal disagreement into moral warfare where opposition becomes evil that must be defeated rather than perspective that might contain truth. Look at how this played out with Lance Armstrong. His entire identity was built around being an inspirational cancer survivor who dominated cycling through pure determination. When that image was threatened by doping allegations, he didn't just lie. He systematically destroyed the careers and lives of people who tried to tell the truth. In his mind, he wasn't protecting his own interests. He was protecting his ability to inspire cancer patients around the world. The psychological trap here is that moral identity becomes so central to self-concept that preserving the appearance of virtue justifies increasingly unvirtuous behavior. You cover up mistakes to protect your ability to do good. You silence critics to prevent them from undermining your noble work. You attack opponents to defend the higher principles they're allegedly threatening. This creates what researchers call ethical fading, a process where moral considerations gradually disappear from decision-making as leaders become focused on maintaining their ethical reputation rather than engaging in ethical behavior. A third manifestation appears in how leaders interpret their relationship with chance and circumstance. Machiavelli wrote that, "Fortune is the arbiter of one half of our actions, but she still leaves us to direct the other half." This wasn't philosophical musing. It was a psychological warning about how successful leaders often lose this crucial balance in catastrophic ways. The psychology here involves what Daniel Kahneman calls the illusion of control, the tendency to overestimate your ability to influence outcomes that are largely determined by factors beyond your control. For most people, this bias is limited by frequent encounters with failure and randomness. But successful leaders have fewer such encounters, which allows the illusion to grow unchecked. When most of your decisions appear to work out well, you begin attributing success to your superior judgment rather than favorable circumstances. When things go badly, you blame external interference rather than poor choices. This creates a systematically distorted understanding of cause and effect that makes you increasingly reckless over time. The trap deepens because confidence attracts resources and followers, which can make even questionable strategies temporarily successful. This creates what psychologists call escalation of commitment, doubling down on failing approaches because admitting error would threaten your identity as someone with exceptional judgment. Consider how Elon Musk's early successes with PayPal, Tesla, and SpaceX convinced him that his intuition was superior to expert analysis across multiple domains. When experienced executives questioned his ambitious timelines or warned about production challenges, he dismissed their concerns as lack of vision. His confidence was so compelling that investors, employees, and media often sided with his optimism over industry expertise until reality eventually imposed its own corrections. The most dangerous aspect of this trap is that it transforms prudent risk management into perceived cowardice. If you believe you can control outcomes through superior decision-making, then preparing for failure seems like defeatism. Taking advice appears unnecessary. Accepting limitations feels like surrendering to mediocrity. This explains why so many brilliant leaders eventually make catastrophically stupid decisions. It's not that they suddenly became incompetent. It's that their earlier competence convinced them they had transcended the constraints that limit ordinary people. As these psychological distortions accumulate, they can trigger what represents the most dangerous extreme of power's reality distortion, the transformation of successful leaders into paranoid authoritarians who view normal opposition as existential threats. Machiavelli observed this pattern with chilling precision. Men should be either treated generously or destroyed, because they take revenge for slight injuries. For heavy ones, they cannot. This wasn't tactical advice for aspiring tyrants. It was a warning about how isolation and delusion transform reasonable people into dangerous ones who can no longer distinguish between criticism and conspiracy. The mechanism operates through what psychologists call hostile attribution bias, the tendency to interpret ambiguous behavior as threatening. When you've lost touch with normal social feedback and your ego has become fragile despite outward confidence, criticism that ordinary people would dismiss as disagreement feels like personal warfare. This perception isn't entirely wrong. Once you've surrounded yourself with sycophants and silenced independent voices, the people who still dare to oppose you often are genuinely hostile. But this creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your increasing authoritarianism provokes legitimate resistance, which confirms your paranoid interpretation of dissent, which justifies even more extreme responses. The progression follows a predictable pattern. Normal criticism gets reinterpreted as coordinated attacks. Honest feedback becomes evidence of disloyalty. Eventually, even neutral behavior seems suspicious because it lacks the enthusiastic support that paranoid leaders require as proof of allegiance. Study how this pattern consumed Joseph Stalin during his rise to absolute power. Stalin didn't start as a paranoid tyrant. He began as a true believer in the revolution, but as power isolated him, his fear hardened into paranoia. He saw sabotage in every disagreement and betrayal in every shadow. Critics weren't just wrong, they were enemies. And so, he crushed them, until no one dared even appear disloyal. The terrifying aspect of this spiral is that it feels strategically necessary from the inside. You're not becoming a tyrant, you're defending important principles against people who don't understand their significance. You're not suppressing legitimate criticism, you're stopping saboteurs who are undermining crucial work. Contemporary technology has transformed Machiavelli's insights from historical curiosities into urgent warnings. His understanding that men in general judge more by the sense of sight than by the sense of touch, because everyone can see but few can test by feeling, has become the operating principle of our information ecosystem, where curated appearances matter more than verified substance and manufactured perception, becomes accepted reality. Modern powerful people don't just have the ability to surround themselves with agreeable advisors. They can construct entire media universes designed to validate their worldview. They can fund research institutions that produce favorable studies, sponsor media outlets that frame every story sympathetically, and deploy social media campaigns that amplify supportive voices while drowning out criticism. But the psychological trap remains the same. Systems built to convince others end up convincing their creators. When you consume information that consistently confirms your brilliance and dismisses your critics as jealous or ignorant, you eventually lose the ability to distinguish between genuine support and manufactured consensus. The algorithmic amplification of this effect makes it particularly dangerous. Social media platforms show you content designed to maximize engagement, which often means increasingly extreme versions of what you already believe. For ordinary users, this creates political polarization. For powerful people who can afford to customize their information diet, it can create complete detachment from reality. Consider how many tech leaders have convinced themselves that they're saving humanity while building systems that exploit psychological vulnerabilities for profit. They consume content that frames their work as visionary innovation, while filtering out information about its harmful effects. They attend conferences where they're celebrated as thought leaders, while avoiding forums where they might encounter serious criticism. The result is a class of leaders who are simultaneously more informed and more deluded than any in history. They have access to more data than ever before, but that data is increasingly curated to support whatever they want to believe. Understanding this psychological trap raises a fundamental question. If power inevitably corrupts perception, how do we create systems that keep leaders grounded in reality? The answer requires acknowledging a brutal paradox. The very mechanisms that make reality checking necessary also make leaders increasingly resistant to it. The most effective historical examples involved leaders who institutionalized dissent before they lost the capacity to tolerate it. Abraham Lincoln's team of rivals cabinet wasn't just political theater. It was a deliberate attempt to preserve access to uncomfortable truths by surrounding himself with people who had publicly opposed him and retained independent power bases. Franklin D. Roosevelt employed a similar strategy through what historians call competitive chaos. He deliberately created overlapping responsibilities and encouraged his advisors to disagree with each other, ensuring that multiple perspectives always reached his attention. He understood that harmony in leadership often signals the death of critical thinking. Modern examples include Ray Dalio's Bridgewater Principles, which institutionalize what he calls radical transparency, a system where anyone can challenge anyone regardless of hierarchy, and where being wrong is treated as a learning opportunity rather than a source of shame. But these systems only function when leaders genuinely reward honesty and punish flattery rather than the reverse. The challenge is that implementing these safeguards requires leaders to voluntarily accept regular psychological discomfort in exchange for better decision-making. They must choose temporary ego bruising over long-term institutional health. This is an unnatural choice that goes against the basic psychological rewards that make power attractive in the first place. Organizations that successfully preserve reality contact typically embed these mechanisms into their structure rather than relying on individual virtue. They create formal processes for dissent, anonymous feedback systems, and regular red team exercises designed to identify blind spots. They reward people for raising uncomfortable questions and rotate advisors to prevent the formation of insular cliques. But even these institutional safeguards require constant vigilance because the psychological pressure to subvert them never disappears. The moment leaders start punishing honesty or rewarding sycophancy, the entire system begins deteriorating back toward comfortable delusion. 5 centuries after Machiavelli documented the psychology of power, his insights have become more relevant, not less. We live in an era where the tools for self-deception have never been more sophisticated, where the resources available to powerful people for constructing alternate realities have never been greater, and where the consequences of leadership delusion have never been more far-reaching. The fundamental lesson isn't that powerful people are evil. It's that power itself is psychologically corrupting in predictable, systematic ways. The isolation that comes with authority, the constant performance of competence, the availability of people willing to validate whatever you want to believe. These aren't personal failings but structural features of how power operates in human societies. This understanding carries profound implications for how we think about leadership, institutional design, and our own relationship with authority. Every person who achieves significant influence faces the same psychological pressures that transformed brilliant strategists into delusional autocrats, visionary entrepreneurs into fraud perpetrators, and idealistic reformers into paranoid tyrants. The solution isn't to avoid power or romanticize powerlessness. Effective leadership remains essential for addressing complex collective challenges. Instead, we need to approach power with the same kind of systematic caution we bring to other dangerous but necessary activities. We don't avoid flying because planes can crash. We invest heavily in safety systems, training protocols, and regulatory oversight that minimize the risks. Similarly, we need to treat leadership as an inherently hazardous activity that requires constant safeguards. This means building institutions that preserve reality contact even when leaders don't want it. It means creating cultures that reward intellectual humility and punish arrogant certainty. It means developing technologies and practices that make self-deception more difficult and honest, feedback more accessible. But perhaps most importantly, it means recognizing that the responsibility for preventing leadership delusion doesn't rest solely with leaders themselves. Everyone who interacts with powerful people, employees, advisors, journalists, citizens, plays a role in either enabling their self-deception or helping them stay grounded. The next time you encounter a leader making decisions that seem disconnected from reality, remember Machiavelli's warnings. They may not be corrupt or stupid. They might be intelligent people caught in psychological traps that are as predictable as they are dangerous. And that recognition should motivate us not just to judge them, but to build better systems that make such traps less likely to claim future leaders. The price of good leadership, like the price of freedom itself, is eternal vigilance, not just against external threats, but against the internal psychological forces that transform protectors into predators and servants into masters. Understanding what Machiavelli saw 5 centuries ago may be our best hope for building institutions worthy of the power we invest in them.